morning, everybody. Thank you so much for sparing some time for us to have a discussion this morning about the overall development agenda in the final 3 years of the Millennium Development Goals and what comes next after 2015. As all of you know, and I'm sure as many of you are engaged, there's a tremendous amount of discussion about what needs to come next, what we've learned from the MDGs that we could take into the next period. And there are some pretty strong differences of opinion as well among various actors in the international scene, including differences within Europe, and differences certainly as usual between developing country perspectives and high-income country perspectives. So let me give you just a few minutes of my own thoughts about this issue. I'll just speak for myself, not for the UN or Secretary General, but my own reflections on this period of the last dozen years of the Millennium Development Goals and what I think that implies for what we ought to do in the post-2015 period. I think the MDGs have been surprising and surprisingly useful. And this is probably my starting point. It has been good to have global goals around development objectives. This was not obvious a dozen years ago. In fact, I would say not obvious at all. There have been many UN goals over the years. Not all of them stick. In fact, probably most of them do not stick. And when the Millennium Development Goals were first promulgated, their shelf life certainly would have been in doubt. Indeed, as you'll know, when the Millennium Development Goals were first set in September 2000, adopted at the Millennium Summit, they weren't even adopted as Millennium Development Goals. I think the world leaders weren't so clear on what they were adopting when they adopted the Millennium Declaration at that summit. It was a year later that one page of that large declaration was excerpted as 8 goals and then put under the rubric of Millennium Development Goals. And the world said, oh, we adopted that. And we are now 11 years under that auspices. When then Secretary General Kofi Annan asked me to advise him and advise the UN system on the Millennium Development Goals in 2001, I met with many, many groups and leaders of development, and generally the reception, I would say, was pretty frosty. What is this? Why should we care? These are dumb. Why are they defined this way? Why isn't this in it? Why is this in it? Why 2/3, not this? Why 1/2? Lots and lots of complaints. As probably would be par for the course, and lots of skepticism that these goals could amount to much that was useful at all. I really admired Claire Short at the time for not only having helped put this on the agenda, but her view was just focus on this, don't deviate. And once when I said, well, maybe we should do something else also, she nearly took my head off. No, we have one set of goals. This is what we're focusing on. We will not talk about or do anything else. I learned to see the wisdom of that. Not only was that a strong politician's view, but it has a lot of merit, actually. She helped to set a course which took them seriously at a time when few did. And what did transpire, I've seen over the last decade, is more and more appreciation of the fact that it's not so bad that the world has some goals that are relatively clearly understood, even if surprisingly difficult to measure, by the way, though these are not so fancy in what they're stated. The measurements are not anywhere with the precision and the timeliness that we'd like them to be. But still, more and more people gravitated to these goals. NGOs, governments, donor agencies, UN agencies, even the World Bank eventually started talking, even the US government eventually started talking about the Millennium Development Goals and started to organize discussion, thinking, policy, planning around the Millennium Development Goals. Probably, by the way, the biggest single push for the Millennium Development Goals came from the Bush administration in 2005 when they tried to expunge the Millennium Development Goals. In the summit in 2005, we had the lovely Ambassador John Bolton, who would storm around the UN with smoke coming out of his ears. He came in at a time when the draft final outcome for 2005 was being negotiated as the first review of the Millennium Development Goals, and he proposed to excise the phrase Millennium Development Goals hundreds of times from that document because the US to that date had never accepted the idea of Millennium Development Goals. It used the phrase International Development Goals, including those in the Millennium Declaration, which didn't quite have the same brand value as Millennium Development Goals. So the ambassador struck this out from the US draft proposals hundreds of times, and it led to an incredible world unanimity to push back against the United States. And never was there more support for the MDGs than what came after the attempt to eliminate the MDGs. And delegations went to Kofi Annan and said, we will not have a summit unless the MDGs are in there. We will never agree to anything unless the MDGs are agreed, and so forth. And the US backed down. The summit in 2005 endorsed the Millennium Development Goals. That was the last frontal attack on them. But it actually raised their brand value significantly, public awareness, and so on. I am in dozens of countries every year, and it's amazing to me how much these goals animate public discussion, newspaper columns, and government leaders' rhetoric. And maybe because of my position, which would not be so exalted as to justify what I'm about to say, world leaders inevitably start, Mr. Sachs, we're achieving the Millennium Development Goals, feeling that this is something that they have to justify, explain, and so on. It's quite surprising, actually, how often that comes up and how high on the rhetorical level they are taken. It's certainly surprising for somebody from the United States because you can go months at a time without hearing Millennium Development Goals. In the US context, I don't know how many times. I know that George Bush mentioned them once in 2005. We nearly dropped off his seat when he said the phrase, given what had just transpired, but he did say it at the UN General Assembly. And President Obama's probably used the phrase a few times over the last 4 years, but most Americans would not know what they are at all. And we have no political life around them at all. But when you travel almost any place else, they are an animating principle. And I also believe, from what I've seen, that they've had a big effect on the creativity of many hundreds of organizations around the world in key areas, whether it's agriculture, public health, infrastructure, student groups, government organizations, as I said, major businesses, UN agencies, and the like. So this brings me to the future. Having global goals, in my view, is extremely important. And I think we really should work hard to have post-2015 goals agreed globally. This will not be easy because, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which weren't even MDGs when they were adopted, this time we're going in with eyes open and a tremendous amount of discussion and debate. And the world's really good at debating and not so good at agreeing on anything. And so the idea that we're going to get to a coherent vision of what the 2015 and onward agenda should be is a pretty stiff and difficult order for us to achieve. Now, as you know, there are two tracks to this which make it even more complicated. One track is the MDG track itself, which set in motion that there would be a review of the Millennium Development Goals and a discussion about what should come afterward. And it's in that context that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed the high-level panel for the post-2015 priorities, co-chaired by Prime Minister Cameron and President Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia and President Yudhoyono of Indonesia. That high-level panel is operating under the rubric of the next steps beyond the MDGs. Simultaneously with that, and in a complementary process, are the discussions around the Sustainable Development Goals that were endorsed at the Rio Plus 20 summit this summer. This is a different process, not just a different mechanism to get to the same point, but a different track of global diplomacy. That one goes from Rio to Rio Plus 20 to the idea of having international goals around sustainable development. And as you know, at the Rio Plus 20 summit, not only was there an endorsement of SDGs, but an intergovernmental process was established, or the intention to establish an intergovernmental process was agreed that would set the framework for the SDGs. That is also taking place, but more slowly, because it requires a group of 30 experts to be designated by count of the various geographic regions of the UN. Each region is supposed to set a certain number of experts to this process, and that's not happened yet, in part because the regions couldn't agree on exactly who would get how many slots of the overall amount, as if that could make such a big difference, by the way. It won't, but in any event, it has made enough to create delays. So we have these two processes going on side by side, and we have a pretty big debate on what to do and whether these two processes are distinct or whether they should merge. So there is a view, and it's held by a number of different actors, that these are two distinct sets of processes that should remain distinct after 2015. There are the fans of the Millennium Development Goals that say they're working, keep the focus on fighting extreme poverty, basically set further objectives around hunger, income, education, health, and so forth. And that would be the post-2015 framework. And there are those on the other side of the or on the other track who say we really need basically environmental goals because we have a growing environmental calamity, and the Sustainable Development Goals should be essentially around ecosystem sustainability. Let's keep that as a separate track. And you can see how that can create a kind of alliance of interests which says, go on your own way, we'll go on our way. And it happens that within Europe, there's divided sentiment about this question, but one part of the process is that the post-MDG agenda tends to be in the development ministries, and the SDG agenda tends to be in the environment ministries. And you'd be surprised how the two ministries don't talk to each other or are battling over their particular turf to the point of saying we really need two very distinct processes. My own view as professor of sustainable development is that this is foolhardy to go that way. It would be reckless. And it would be reckless because there is no way in the world that poverty can be alleviated without a full attention to the environmental crisis of the world. And that to talk about doing one without the other, or failing to think about the integration of the economic, the social, and the environmental, would make it impossible to achieve any of these objectives. So I find it intellectually extraordinarily weak to say we want to keep the focus on poverty, don't burden us with the environmental issues. And it's not just, by the way, a mistake of some to say keep the focus on poverty, don't dilute the MDG agenda, that I find wrong-headed, but there are many development actors and many poor country groups that think that the green agenda or the sustainable development agenda is actually an attack on development. And so it's worse than that. Don't bring in environment. That's a trap to close the door behind the rich world and to keep the poor world ever from developing. And again, I think nothing could be further from the truth. If anybody is going to pay the horrendous price of failing to deal with the environment, sad to say, it will be the poor countries, both because of their inherent increased vulnerability given their poverty, and given the fact that poor people live in places that are extraordinarily vulnerable to climate change and to other major environmental risks like ocean acidification and destruction of the marine environment. And so if I were a poor country representative, I think I would be the first to be arguing, don't you dare keep these two agendas separate. That will absolutely condemn us to poverty. We won't stand a chance because we're feeling more and more shocks, more and more disarray, more and more difficulty of achieving food security, public health goals, and so forth because of the rising environmental catastrophes. So I'm very much hoping that these two agendas come together because I think that from a conceptual point of view of the kinds of policies that we need, as well as a global political point of view, and I didn't say enough about this, keeping them apart would be devastating to both agendas. On the political side, I can't imagine the world being able to focus on two distinct sets of goals, one for the rich countries, one for the poor, or one for the poor, one for the middle income and rich, whatever it is. It just strikes me from a branding point of view, a motivational point of view, a political organizational point of view, so difficult as also to be a complete red flag. We can barely keep our eyes on one set of goals, but to propose that there would be two, I think would be so taxing of the political agenda that we would end up inevitably having either utter neglect or cross fights between two agendas that shouldn't be fighting with each other but are absolutely in need of working coherently with each other. So I'm personally hoping that we arrive at a set of sustainable development goals that have as their first pillar the end of extreme poverty. In other words, put the Millennium Development Goal aspirations front and center, number one, very clear, that by 2030, extreme poverty should be ended. That's possible to do. We have it within the means of the world, certainly to achieve that, though it is by no means automatic or easy, but it is absolutely achievable. So my own view is that we should have 4 pillars to a set of post-2015 goals. The first would be ending extreme poverty in all its forms. One of the wonderful things about the Millennium Development Goals is that they define poverty holistically for the first time. So we moved beyond the World Bank dollar a day idea to a holistic vision of what extreme poverty means. It means income poverty, hunger, lack of food security, lack of rights of girls and women, children not in school, lack of access to basic public health services, lack of access to water and sanitation. That was a very good functional definition of what extreme poverty is. Extreme poverty means when you can't meet basic needs along these various dimensions, and the MDGs did a great favor of making that multidimensional vision of poverty much clearer and much more operational. So the first dimension would be end poverty in all its forms. The second dimension of sustainable development is social inclusion. And this is a challenge for rich and poor countries alike. We have rising inequality within just about every part of the world, and the challenges not only of basic human rights, gender discrimination, ethnic, religious discrimination, but also greatly widened income inequality, point us to the importance of social inclusion, which is the second pillar in general of the Sustainable Development Agenda. The third part of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the third pillar, is clearly the environmental agenda, and I don't need to belabor the point that the crisis is deep, getting worse, and on a timetable that is dreadfully out of line with our public policies. We simply have not been able to get organized over the last 20 years to do real things about climate change, oceans, biodiversity, over extraction of resources of all kinds. And we've lost 20 years of time, and we're already in an era of greatly increased instability climatically and in general environmentally as a result. So the environmental pillars are crucial, urgent, and I think without question vital to achieving anything we want to achieve in rich or poor countries in economic well-being and prosperity. And the fourth dimension that I would add is governance to support the first 3 goals. And the governance objectives for sustainable development seem to me to need a broad view that we need good governance not only in our public sector, but we need to rethink governance of the corporate sector significantly, and governance of all major social institutions as well. The problem with the governance right now is that not only are our governments extremely weak in the face of this complicated agenda, but the corporate sector, which is the strongest sector of our societies everywhere, are not governed in ways that are conducive to sustainable development. And so the whole rethinking of corporate governance, I think, is extremely important. What do I mean by that? First, at least in my country, in the United States, the corporate sector runs the political process to an enormous extent, and this has been a progressive development. I mean, it's a regressive development, but it's been a progressing development over the past 40 years. The power of the corporate sector in setting public policies has become unbearable, based on billions of dollars of lobbying, billions of dollars of campaign financing, essentially a system of legalized corruption that makes it impossible to have coherent, consistent policies in the United States. I would say that many governments face the same challenge right now, that they are basically financed and dominated by powerful corporate interests. Rather than governing and regulating the corporate sector, they are governed and regulated by them. Second, globalization has definitely exacerbated the problem by giving companies more ability to run and hide. I'm very happy that the debates in recent weeks in this country have looked at issues like the taxation of Apple and Google and even Starbucks, our beloved Starbucks. I can barely go a day without stopping in at least 3 or 4 Starbucks, but I do wish they'd pay their taxes. And we now have a legalized system of tax non-payment through the tax havens that is so utterly out of control. It's shambolic to call this anything close to decency. And from the point of view of developing countries, these tax havens are not only places where corporate profits are parked, but where the cloak of anonymity is put onto corporate behavior that ends up being a major part of environmental destruction or social destruction in poor countries. Because every time you look at some corrupt deal on land or on a mining concession or on natural resource extraction in a poor country, you will find a Cayman Island address there or a Bermuda address. You'll find an anonymous company that absolutely is without any accountability, hiding behind this corporate veil, but not just the corporate veil, hiding behind the tax haven veil. So this, I think, is a second area where corporate governance needs a pretty basic remake. And the third is a general set of principles about what corporate responsibility means in terms of environmental and social accountability. A lot of countries have very weak environmental protections or defenses. There's a fascinating case underway, which many of you will be aware of, between Chevron and Ecuador, where Ecuador has sued Chevron over its dealings in Ecuador, found guilty, and Chevron says, well, we absolutely do not subscribe to the judicial process of Ecuador. We're more powerful than that, and they're actually suing a number of now U.S. NGOs, Chevron suing a number of U.S. NGOs that have been defending Ecuador's position in these lawsuits, subpoenaing records and generally behaving very abusively. And so the power of the companies is very vast. The ability of countries to hold the companies to any kind of environmental responsibility is very, very low. And I recently wrote about a comparison of the U.S. Fines and civil damages assessed against BP for the Gulf oil spill compared to what's happened in the Niger Delta over the last 50 years, where the amount of oil spilled has been at least twice that, but the amount of compensation has essentially been zero, and amount of accountability has been zero. So this is a pretty pervasive problem that also needs to be fixed in governance. And we have probably, when we do a serious scrubbing of it, a large number of international rules and regulations, of course under WTO and other areas, also bilateral investment treaties, that almost make it impossible to enforce sustainable development standards right now, because they protect investors to the point of preventing sustainable development practices by host countries. And so this also needs a thorough review. So in my opinion, we do need these four pillars, or four dimensions, however you want to call them, of putting the economic, the social, the environmental, and the governance together into a coherent framework. And if we do that, and I'll just stop here, I think that this offers us an opportunity to add a second major dimension to what has so far been an extraordinarily frustrating attack on the environmental problems. Rio Plus 20 was not only an occasion for endorsing sustainable development goals, but of course it was a review of the three main treaties that were adopted at the Rio Earth Summit. And what's absolutely striking, and we've just finished the Doha negotiations yesterday, so we've seen it again, is that the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, which are three excellent treaties. If you read them, they're really impressive. Well drafted, thoughtful, forward-looking, universal, almost universal. The United States did not sign the Convention on Biological Diversity because Newt Gingrich was able to convince the Congress that property rights mean the right to drive species to extinction, and so property rights should take precedence over conservation of biological diversity. But nearly universal treaties that have had almost no impact over 20 years. So we clearly need something more. And what I would suggest is that the lesson of the MDG that I started with, that global goals that mobilize civil society and mobilize the public imagination as to what can be done, can be surprisingly powerful, and we shouldn't be cynical about them. We should understand that there really is something important to agreeing to do things in the world, and that even if it doesn't inspire the cynics, it does inspire enough people who want to act that something can happen. And I dream of having a succinct set of goals that have these core pillars to them, put in language that is clear, understandable, and recitable by a sixth grader anywhere around the world, and where every child around the world learns these goals over the next 15 years, and when asked, why are these goals important for your country, whether it's Cameroon or Mali or Cambodia or the UK or the United States, that child will have a good answer, that these goals are important for a healthy, safe future for me and for the planet. And if we can get there, I think we will be very pleasantly surprised at what a difference it can make. Thanks very much.